This is Rob Johnson, President of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I'm here on a podcast for the second time with Dr. Peter Temin, who is a great influence in my life as an undergraduate at MIT, and have known him and one of my other mentors, our research director, Tom Ferguson, and he have been co-authors of many things. I remember particularly papers on the 1930s, 20s, and 30s in Germany as being very, very powerful. He's the Elisha Gray II Professor Emeritus in the Economics Department at MIT. He's done a number of extraordinary books over the years, but more recently, The Vanishing Middle Class has been, how do I say, it's almost like the talking points of INET. It's the guiding, like when you travel, you buy a folder's guide. But when you talk about what INET's supposed to do, you read The Vanishing Middle Class, and that gets you off at least in the global north, that tells you what to do. He's obviously written this new book, Never Together, about the problems of race in the United States. I remember him being a very profound speaker at our 2016 conference in my home city of Detroit, where we, experienced firsthand in my upbringing a lot of the kind of problems and challenges that you underscore. This book is part of the Studies in New Economic Thinking at Cambridge University Press, which is the INET series on what we think is at the cutting edge or the most important things to feature. So, Peter, thank you for being here, and thank you for being part of our efforts to illuminate the challenges that we face.
Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here with you, Rob.
Well, we have a lot to cover today, a lot of very, very powerful, historic, sometimes uncomfortable historical experience, but sometimes you got to take the medicine in order to heal.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, from your inner experience, how did you become inspired to write this book? Is there an aha moment, or is it just the culmination of things? You're very good at economic history, analytic history. There are wonderful tables, charts, references to historical episodes that make your point. This book it's kind of how I wish an economist was, able to integrate all of these things. And but I'm just curious, what triggered your setting off on this course?
Well, a couple of years ago, when the American Economic Association was meeting in Atlanta, I figured, who would I like to talk to? And that was Trevin Logan, a Black economic historian that I like very much. And we talked, and out of that talk came a paper that I wrote with Trevin, which is now up on the INET website.
That's right.
And then someone who knows the field said it looked very much like the outline of a book. And by that, Trevin had been promoted to a time-consuming job at Ohio State. So I wrote the book on my own. So it grows out of the racial comments in The Vanishing Middle Class. And it starts with the Constitution and the notion that when they said all men, that meant all white men.
I remember at the outset of your book, just to create an example, I think you created something that echoed throughout the book. Yeah. It was from the Statue of Liberty.
From the Statue of Liberty.
And the quote was, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore.
Yes.
Send these, the homeless, tempest lost, to me.
Yes.
I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Now, how would I say? Practice what you preach is what comes to my mind. The old
Right.
the old song by Barry White. It doesn't feel. It feels like the vision we created of America to inspire people to believe in it and follow it is not what we've been doing.
Right. Well, at that point, it meant both European and African immigrants. And the African immigrants were slaves, and the European immigrants had farms, and they used the farms, these slaves, to farm their grounds, so on, and that led to a inequality of income. So there were two attempts to include blacks in the mainstream economy. Reconstruction followed the Civil War, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society followed World War One and World War II. Excuse me.
World War II. That's right.
Yes, right. And the first one eliminated slavery, but it did not grant freedmen 40 acres and a mule. And the effects wore off by the end of the 19th century. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society followed World War II, promised black voting and education, but it ended more quickly under Reagan and Clinton, and when trade hurt rural whites in the 1990s. Whites reacted badly to both experiences. And that's because Gilded Ages increased racism. The Gilded Age followed Reconstruction. White South was secured by the 1876 presidential compromise. It brought the South into the U.S. by excluding blacks. Then Jim Crows followed in the 1890s, which restricted black education and program, which lasted until World War II again. Our Gilded Age followed Johnson's Great Society. Rich people do not want to pay taxes because they want to reduce services to workers, blacks, Latinos, and other poor people. They imprison blacks and the other poor people. Now, the Jim Crow laws, the North industrialized and expanded West. The South remained agriculture and focused on cotton. Jim Crow laws segregated blacks. Southern labor markets were not linked to Northern ones, and freedmen earned less than whites, and that continues until today. Laws and lynching discouraged black voting, peaked in the 1880s and continued into 1920s. The Great Migration started in World War I when skilled blacks went north. Southern wages fell while Northern wages rose. So Nixon started the war on drugs. He demonized blacks who opposed Vietnam and replaced Johnson's poverty war with his drug war. The U.S. now has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. 3 in black men go to prison during their lives, and drug laws are new Jim Crow laws. blacks are 12% of population and 40% of prisoners. Incarceration is now stable at high levels. No releases, or very few releases, I read about a couple, are for COVID, despite prison illnesses. Nixon racism is shown from the view of his top advisors. John Ehrlichman said that Nixon had two enemies, the antitrust left and the black people. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meeting, and vilify them night after night on the coming news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, confirmed this. The whole problem is really the blacks. Okay. So the U.S., to repeat, has 5% of the world population and 25% of the world prisoners. Mass incarceration is hardly mentioned in policy discussions. How many people know that 1 out of 3 African Americans, men, go to prison at today's incarceration rate? These are problems that urgently need to be addressed. America was in turmoil in the 60s through the 1980s. The urban riots spread in the late 1960s. The war on drugs, started by Nixon, expanded by Reagan. 1986 and 1988 laws set minimum jail terms for drug crimes. The penalty for crack cocaine was 100 times the penalty for powder cocaine. Blacks use crack cocaine. Whites use powder. The Kerner Commission, issued in 1968, the commission clearly stated that the problems were societal. Riots were started by blacks trying for equality with whites. But Nixon created the war on drugs, crimes on individuals. He wanted to condemn blacks who opposed the Vietnam War. He wanted individual crimes to demonize blacks, which they still do, creating a new Jim Crow. That's from Michelle Alexander's book. Mm-hmm. Race and income were important. Race described mass incarceration incidents. Blacks are more imprisoned than whites. The differences increase with family incomes, more than 3 times higher for poorest blacks than white blacks. Poor black boys are destroyed by prisons. No education, no workplace skills, unable to form families. Crime and prison are a way of life. Black men remain a permanent underclass.
Well, in reading your book, I could see this, which you might call oscillation. It was almost like a pendulum. People could see things that were wrong. The famous basketball player, Isaiah Thomas, who played with the Detroit Pistons for years, I saw him on his daughter used to work with my wife. And I saw him on a show. It was like a video show with a woman named Lorna Johnson in Los Angeles. Yeah. And he said, it's very frustrating to see the government resisting when you're talking about human rights. But what we really need is not human rights. What we need is birthrights. If you're a human being, you get the same portfolio as everyone else. Yeah. And I thought that was a kind of how we get there is a different question. But I thought that was a very powerful sense. And I myself, I've studied a lot of what you might call how music reflects the stress in a society. And people talk about, the spirituals. My favorite writer on music is a theologian, the late James Cone, who I used to interact with quite frequently at Union Theological Seminary. And he said, the spirituals are about the afterlife. Nothing you can do in this life.
Right.
But the blues are from the Jim Crow era, when you are allegedly free, but you're not free. Blues is about defiance in code in the here and now.
Yeah.
So they'd go in to the juke joint knowing there were people with guns and nooses, and they would sing in code, "My baby left me, my baby left me." And sometimes even the boss man would say, "My baby's mean to me too," and they'd enjoy the performance. But what they didn't realize is the baby that left him, the baby that was treating him bad, was code for their professional life, for working in the field, for working in the cotton area. And so there was a kind of rallying point from these different types of music that interacted with the social conditions. But what I keep seeing, as I read your book, I see it codified so nicely, is, I mean, I won't say nicely, that's probably not right. It's daunting to read, but it's skillfully done, is we seem to have this urge to do the right thing as humans, to abide by the principles, say, of our founding documents, Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, and then we don't do it. And sometimes it's for commercial reasons, sometimes just based on historic fear, and we back off. And then we see an episode like lots of black people fighting in World War II, and we back off. Then we do the civil rights movement. I remember James Baldwin being concerned when Dr. King was murdered, that the Black Panthers would frighten people and create a counter-revolution, which, as someone said, turned the war on poverty into the war on drugs.
Yeah.
And you seem to bring these things to the surface over and over again, that it's almost like an oscillating pendulum, but the fulcrum's not really moving very far.
That's right. That's very good. And I've written on that. There's a kind of equilibrium. You can derive that mathematically. That says we're in a stable position. I was helped by Bob Solow, Nobel Prize winner, whom I'm still in contact with at Brooklyn. So on. And there's a PBS station special on the people going on the coming to the outcome of jail and trying desperately to get to be part of the white economy and jobs and so on. So I recommend that to everyone. And I told Bob about that. And he was interested. Good. Okay.
Well, I'm grinning because Bob Solow was my faculty advisor when I was an undergraduate at MIT, and so I learned a lot from him, and I'm very grateful for his support and guidance throughout my life.
Yeah.
But I look at that when you talk about that. People emerging from prison and how to reconnect with the world. I remember something that you gave in a talk that I wanted to bring up. I think it's probably, I do believe it's in the book. You talked about the kinds of behavior that economists might talk about.
Yes.
One would be customary behavior, kind of doing what you did yesterday. And one was, I don't know, I'll call it inspired behavior. And the third was subjecting yourself to command behavior, and that the people in the prison aren't allowed to grow
Yes.
that inspired behavior, that thinking about a better future, that support in regenerating. And I mean, if you believe in redemption, somebody in prison might feel bad about what they did in an impulsive moment and want to learn and become a better person. And that's not on offer, but the command behavior is fiercely there, which probably wounds and scars people, that makes it harder to come out of prison and regain trust in humanity.
Yes. Well, Professor Freeman at Harvard calls those the black elite, which are the residue of the Great Society of President Johnson. And they've done well and have been accepted. If you get education, you can fit within the kind of education you need. And when I visited my eldest child, my daughter Liz, who is coming to visit me this afternoon, has the various books on there, and she said, "Do you realize that Colin already has more books than most people have in their lifetimes?" And that's why pre-K adventure, which is still in the bill, but the bill hasn't been passed, because of opposition to this, which still keeps, because the unemployment has kind of come back. The Powell is very cautiously working for this so he can try and avoid a recession at the end of the inflation, so on. But the volatility has come for all these people that the Republican Party now embraces of violence. And so it's very hard to know where we're going to go from here.
Mm-hmm. Let me explore that for just a second. Coming from Detroit, seeing the Midwest, obviously, it's a black majority city.
Right.
But what I've also seen is what I'll call the Trumpian reaction in outstate Michigan.
Right. Yes.
As the old saying, the rising tide raises all boats. Well, when the tide goes out, all the boats go down.
Yes.
And what I saw in Michigan particularly, and it's been vivid since George Floyd's murder, is that these people, these white people there are saying, wait a minute, the ship's sinking on me too. And they get, if you will, jealous that people are trying to talk about uplifting. And I don't mean doing it. I mean talking about uplifting black people in 400 years of woundedness. And they use the phrase reparations. And these people say, we're getting trashed as well. And they are very large numbers. And so I don't think, and you've talked about this, and others have. I know John Paul, who's on my board at Berkeley, is that when the economy suffers, insecurity goes up, diseases of despair go up, and racial animosity goes up. The blaming of others is a disease associated with despair.
Yes, and in Flint, Michigan, a Republican governor sent supervisors to go on who wanted to cut money. And so he went off the river from getting food, water, and had illnesses, which have still not, still continuing for this. There's settlement going on. And they have impaired the younger blacks in the Flint. So
Hmm.
it's kind of Republicans doing what they wanted with the black population of Flint, and they're now back on the river.
Hmm.
But they haven't had their pipes replaced even now.
And these were lead pipes that created the
That's right.
toxins that created the disease, right? I remember the
Exactly.
Flint water crisis. And there was a woman there who's mentioned in your book
Right.
who
Exactly.
said what a tragedy it is that they aren't learning the lesson of those lead pipes and replacing them all over the country urgently.
Yeah.
That tolerating the poisoning, in this
Yeah.
case, particularly of black people, is just horrid. And
Right. Right. And
the,
so, but
the irony, the
that's
irony too.
proceeding very slowly, like
Yeah.
the infrastructure program that Biden did pass is only slowly getting started, which you
Hmm.
can notice by the potholes in Cambridge. So there,
Yeah.
I remind that to my class. Okay.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And this, the irony in Michigan, whether it's Detroit water and sewage or Flint,
Yeah.
is you're sitting there. I mean, when I was a kid, my dad was a sailor.
Yeah.
When you were in Lake Huron, when I was a kid, if you were thirsty, you could take a ladle and stick it in the water and drink it.
Right.
The good quality fresh water in Lake Huron
Yeah.
is plentiful and not far from Flint, Michigan. The
Right.
idea that happened there is just horrific.
Yes, it is. It is horrible. But
And you could almost say, because of the rivalry between Detroit and what I'll call outstate, I
yeah.
wonder if the governor thought he was doing something to rally the enthusiasm by being cruel to the black people in Flint. That's just a hypothesis. I can't
Yeah.
project onto the individual, but it seems awfully hideous.
Well, he
Yeah.
was the man who appointed the supervisor of Flint, so you can blame him.
Mm,
Yes.
mm.
Yes.
And the Detroit bankruptcy was kind of an anomaly too, because if you have a company that goes bankrupt, it has no revenue to pay people.
Right.
The state of Michigan had a tax base so that, I'll just say it, women that worked in Detroit
Yes.
for 45 years in the municipal public service had their pensions cut in half and their health care removed.
Yes.
That's a choice. That's not a bankruptcy.
Yes.
That's a distributional choice. It's a really ugly
It's
thing that
very
they
old.
did with yeah. But
And it's like mass incarceration. Nobody talks about it anymore in the policy
yeah,
grounds. It's just not changing at the moment.
yeah. I
It's
know
just continuing.
Heather Ann Thompson, who's a professor at University of Michigan, and she's written books on Attica Prison and so forth, did some studies on when prisons were privatized and built in upstate Michigan.
Yeah.
What happened is lots of fathers got arrested in and around Detroit and put in those prisons, and
Yeah.
the performance in schools deteriorated
Absolutely.
because of the emotional turmoil of the children, and then teachers who were being assessed based on things like multiple choice tests started to migrate out of Detroit because they were being penalized for something they had no control over.
Right.
And so the entire social disintegration associated with accelerating the building of prisons and having them fully occupied was just ripping that culture apart.
Right.
And I know that's been true I've heard similar stories about Cleveland, parts of Illinois, Atlanta, and
Yes. Well, many people have gone back when the prejudice got to be too much. But even there, they're put out for prison put them out for mining activities, for which famously they die often, and that's in my book, and so on. An illustration of that, yes, and so on. Yes, I report all of these things that have gone from Freedman's Day in Pittsburgh, that made Trump reschedule his rally there, to the problems elsewhere, and so on, and other places where that had been come under kind of blacks given equal rights were then driven out of the city. Yes, so it's a continual process, and we're by no means out of it today.
And I see
and people often say that who write about prisons often say that the incomes of blacks or the imprisonment of blacks is done by consultation with the other people, and they often give the blacks, that's to avoid the minimum sentence there, and so they give them car theft or violent activity and send them back to prison. Much more the blacks than the whites. And there's now a movement among policemen to stop to end the traffic stops, which led one black woman to commit suicide, to end. And so let's hope that they carry this forward on a national plane.
I have a friend who works on a television series called Law and Order.
Yeah.
And I went for a walk with him. His name's Fred Berner. And he said to me that as he studies what's happening in society, say, since the time of George Floyd's murder, is a very deep conflictedness among people in the mid-career in law enforcement. In essence, saying what I'll call PTSD kind of symptoms are occurring because these people thought they were coming in to play a role stabilizing society. Then you have an extremely unjust society, which is unstable, and then they feel they have to escalate. And I'll add one other dimension. Fred didn't say this. The absence of gun control in America makes law enforcement officers very frightened compared to those in other countries. And so what I'll call meltdown emotionally of people in law enforcement who are caught in this cauldron, it actually tends to make them, out of fear, even more aggressive.
Yes. And so we don't know where it's going to go yet, but it is dangerous. And so we're really very offended by it. Yes. And so we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Well,
but
I think
given the inequality of income, if or when the Republicans get into power, most likely at this coming election, they'll try and turn back all of the progress that Biden has tried to make.
Well, let's move from, I guess what I'll call, I'm a doctor's son, from diagnosis to remedy. Let's say a bipartisan commission
Yes.
from the United States Congress came to you and I, and they said, we're really scared.
Yes.
The wheels are spinning off this vehicle called the United States of America.
Yes. I
And
agree.
we know we got to change course. So, Dr. Temin,
Yes.
what do you and Rob Johnson say is what we have to do to get back on track, consistent with our founding principles, and move away from this pendulum, which has had what you might call a hideous equilibrium for many, many years?
Well, the way I end my new book is that you have to promote the education of blacks, which is why that's the pre-K is still part of the reconciliation bill. Let's hope it lasts through the passage of it. Okay, and they need to give blacks the vote and make sure that they can vote so that they can express their views. And the Republicans are very, getting the vote and getting the reconfiguring the voting populations so that they can ensure them of getting a Republican.
So you're talking about gerrymandering and voter suppression activities.
The Trump organization is opposing on them. Yes. So they have become the party of violence, too. Yes. So we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah. But education is the key. What would you? Yeah, and voter suppression. And then I guess I was going to ask you, because we've alluded to it, when a person is in prison. I mean, I understand, like Jim Heckman would talk about pre-K teaches you how to work with other people and exist in a school, and by the time you're 7 and your brain develops, you're emotionally comfortable and you thrive. And all of society saves from having basically everything from prenatal nutrition to early childhood education. But what if somebody is in prison in midstream, say 26 years old and in prison? What do you do to take them out of that command behavior and have what you might call a rehabilitation or a augmentation of their skills in a way where they can start to feel a confidence that they can live a better life when they leave prison? How do we put that together?
That's very hard. And there are a number of private and tax-exempt organizations that try and give these prisoners a chance to reorient themselves. But the national government doesn't do anything but give them their clothes back, send them on a bus home. So that's pointing out what you can do at the fringes, but it's not pointing out what's needed. And education at this point is dying at the moment in the United States because the teachers are so ill paid that you need to raise them. A few states have done so on, but the inflation is just keeping them even with the cost of living. So it's very hard at the moment.
Yeah, or you allow people to take their money offshore and call it tax avoidance rather than tax evasion, which used to be a crime.
Right.
Because we've changed the game in the globalized world. And then everybody turns around and scratches their head and says, we can't afford it. Well, we can afford it if we change our priorities. And
if we change our priorities.
Yeah.
Yes, but we have to change our priorities.
So are you hopeful that we might be, because of this suffering, whether it's climate or pandemic or racial, how would I say, hideousness that you have documented in this book, are you, sometimes they say it's darkest before dawn. Are you
Yeah.
at all hopeful that the stress now is going to propel us into a different direction than we've been on, say, since 1970?
Well, there were lots of demonstrations against the blacks. But after that, the budgets of the police were regained. So we're going to change, but I don't know how quickly,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. And unless we can tax the Republicans, and Piketty has a new book saying that for that and advocating taxes. But that's not going to come about very soon either.
So there may be light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a pretty long tunnel.
Yes, that's what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, Peter, I want to say to you, I mentioned at the outset that I've learned from you for many, many years, but I want my young scholars to understand how vital you are, how determined you are, how you've set yourself on a course. And it's not what you might call hiding in the apron strings of conventional wisdom. You've taken a path, you've seen things that concern you, you've studied them historically, you've studied them in data, and you've elevated and illuminated a very, very painful aspect of the country in which you live. That's what I call courage. And that's been in short supply within academic social science for a very long time.
It has been.
So I want to applaud and I want to thank you for that, because when you set that example, my young scholars can watch an episode like this or read a book like Vanishing Middle Class or Never Together, and it gives them inspiration. And when you said to me the tunnel's long, I agree with you. But those young people are going to be at that end of that tunnel. And if they follow your example, I'm more optimistic.
Let's hope it turns out your way, rather than my pessimistic way.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, through your courage and your effort, ever so slightly perhaps, but you're changing the probabilities in my direction.
Good.
And so, how do I say, actions speak louder than words, and your actions are contributing to a better outcome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for being with me today. And thank you for writing this wonderful book and challenging us all